The Panama Canal connects the two largest oceans on Earth. The Atlantic on one side, the Pacific on the other. Between them, a strip of land so narrow that for 400 years, sailors dreamed of cutting through it, of joining all that water into a single road. And a little over a century ago, they did. And now, that road is running out of water. Not salt water. There is more salt water on either side of this canal than almost anywhere else on the planet. 2 oceans of it, pressing in from both directions. The canal has never wanted for the sea. What it is running out of is rain. Because the Panama Canal does not run on the oceans it connects, it runs on fresh water, rainwater, collected in a single artificial lake that sits 85 feet above the sea. Every time a ship crosses from one ocean to the other, that lake releases around 200 million liters of fresh water, 52 million gallons, and lets it pour, unrecoverable, into the salt. A canal between 2 oceans dying of thirst. Both of these things are true at the same time. The busiest shortcut in the world sits in one of the wettest countries in the world. And in the years when the rain does not come, the whole machine begins to fail. How does a place survive on the one thing it cannot manufacture? In November of 2023, a ship gave the first real answer. It was not a large ship by the standards of this waterway. It was carrying gas, and it was stuck. One of more than 100 vessels backed up at the mouth of the canal, waiting in a line that had stopped moving because a drought had forced the canal to turn ships away. So its owners did something that, a few years earlier, would have sounded absurd. They entered an auction. They bid against every other desperate captain in the queue for the right to skip the line. And they won that right for $4 million. $4 million, paid on top of the ordinary toll, simply to move to the front. And even then, the ship still had to wait nearly a week to cross. It was not a one-time panic. 2.5 years later, in the spring of 2026, it happened again. A tanker paying $4 million for a single slot, as conflict, half a world away, in the Strait of Hormuz, pushed the planet's energy trade back toward Panama. The canal's managers were careful to explain that these auctions are optional, last minute, and rare, that most ships pay nothing close to it. And that is true. But the number tells you something the toll sheet never could. It tells you what it is worth, in a bad year, to get across 65 kilometers of Panama. And it tells you that the thing standing between a ship and $4 million is water. This is the Panama Canal. And to understand why a ship would ever pay a fortune to cross it, you first have to understand what it actually is. Because almost everyone pictures it wrong. The story begins with a piece of geography that looks, on a map, like an invitation. Central America narrows as it runs south, and at its thinnest point, the Isthmus of Panama, barely 80 kilometers of land separate the Caribbean from the Pacific. In 1513, a Spanish captain named Vasco Núñez de Balboa hacked his way across that isthmus through jungle and swamp, climbed a ridge, and became the first European to look west from the Americas and see open ocean. 25 days of misery on foot to cross a gap a modern ship now crosses in a single afternoon. For the next 4 centuries, that gap taunted every empire that traded across it. A ship leaving New York for San Francisco had two choices: sail all the way south around the tip of South America through the storms of Cape Horn, a voyage of months and thousands of extra miles, or stop at Panama, unload everything, carry it across the isthmus, and load it onto a different ship waiting on the far side. When gold was found in California in 1848, that shortcut across Panama filled with desperate men in a hurry to get rich, and a railroad was cut through the jungle to carry them. It was the first transcontinental railroad in the Americas, and it was built at a terrible price. Thousands of workers died of the same fevers that would later kill the canal builders, so many that the railroad company is said to have sold the unclaimed bodies of the dead to medical schools to help cover its costs. The land had already shown, decades before the first canal, exactly what it would demand of anyone who tried to cross it. And there was a rival. For much of the 19th century, the favored route was not Panama at all, but Nicaragua to the north, a longer crossing, but a lower one, using a great lake and a river to carry ships most of the way. Panama won in the end for reasons of engineering and politics as much as geography, but the ghost of that Nicaragua route has never quite died. Even now, it returns to the conversation whenever Panama's canal comes under strain. Because the prize for closing the gap was almost too large to calculate. Roughly 5% of all the world's seaborne trade now moves through this one channel. For the United States, it carries something like 40% of all container traffic: the shoes, the electronics, the grain, the fuel. Nearly 14,000 ships a year, a single cut through a single country, quietly holding up a corner of the global economy. But the map lies. It shows you a narrow ribbon of land, and it whispers, "Just dig a ditch, connect the water. How hard can it be?" The answer is written in the ground here, in concrete and in graves. Because you cannot simply dig a ditch across Panama. The land in the middle rises hundreds of feet above the sea, and a river runs through it that, in the wet season, becomes one of the most violent waterways in the Americas. To join the oceans, the engineers had to do something far stranger than digging. They had to build a bridge of water, and they had to lift the ships into the sky. Here is how it actually works. A ship arriving from the Atlantic does not sail through Panama at sea level. It sails into a chamber of concrete, a lock, and the gates close behind it, sealing it in like a stone box the size of a stadium. Then, through holes in the floor, fresh water begins to pour in from above. No pumps, just gravity and the weight of a lake sitting higher than the ship. The water rises, and the ship rises with it, floating upward inside the chamber until it reaches the level of the next one. The forward gates open, and it moves ahead, and the whole thing repeats. A staircase of chambers, and by the top, the ship has been lifted 85 feet, 26 meters, above the ocean it just left. It is now floating on Gatun Lake, the artificial sea in the middle of the country, and it crosses that lake for miles before another staircase of locks lowers it, chamber by chamber, back down to the far ocean. It is one of the most elegant machines ever built, and it has a single, unforgiving weakness. Every one of those chamber fillings spends water. To carry one ship over the mountains, the locks draw around 200 million liters of fresh water out of Gatun Lake. And when the ship is lowered on the other side, that water runs downhill and is lost, most of it flushed out to sea. The submerged size of the ship makes no difference at all. A small vessel and a giant one each cost the lake the same enormous drink. and Gatun Lake is refilled by exactly one thing: rain. There is no pipeline from the ocean. There could not be. The whole system depends on the water staying fresh because salt water would poison the lake, corrode the machinery, and kill the ecosystem that has grown up around it. So the canal drinks only rain, caught across the surrounding hills and funneled into the lake by the rivers of the watershed. In a normal year, Panama is drenched, as much as 3 meters of rainfall, among the wettest places on the continent. The lake fills faster than the ships can empty it, and no one has to think about the arithmetic. But the arithmetic never went away. It was only hidden by good weather. Push more ships through, and each one takes its 200 million liters. Let the rains come late, or thin, or not at all, and the lake stops refilling. And in a country that thought of itself as impossibly wet, the level of one lake becomes the single most important number in global shipping. That is the machine. Not a ditch where two oceans meet, a staircase of rain, holding the sea at bay on both sides. It helps to say plainly what almost no one pictures correctly. When people hear the Panama Canal, they imagine a trench, a clean slot cut through the land, the Atlantic sloshing directly into the Pacific. That version does not exist. It never did. What exists is a lake in the interior of a country, held 85 feet in the air behind enormous dams, with ships climbing up into it from one ocean and climbing back down out of it to the other. The oceans never touch. The water that does all the work is not theirs. It fell from the sky. You can see the line where the two worlds meet. At the seaward end of the locks, when the gates open and the fresh water of the lake spills down to mix with the ocean, the change is violent enough to stun the fish caught in it. Lake fish flung suddenly into salt, ocean fish into fresh, neither able to survive the crossing. And the birds have learned this. Pelicans and frigate birds and herons gather above the lower chambers, wheeling and diving, because the locks set a table for them several times a day. A strip of easy hunting where the sweet water dies into the sea. It is a small thing, easy to miss beside all that tonnage and machinery. But it is the whole paradox in miniature. Everything that lives here has had to make its peace with the boundary between the fresh water and the salt, the very boundary the entire canal exists to hold. For its first 100 years, that design was Panama's genius. Lately, it has begun to look like Panama's trap. And the trap grew deeper in 2016, when the canal did something that for a while looked like pure triumph. The original locks had a fixed size, and for a century that size ruled the seas. Ships were built precisely to fit them, a class of vessel called Panamax, sized to the very inch of the chambers, because a hull 1 foot too wide could not cross. But by the 21st century, the world's shipping had outgrown Panama. Vast new container ships and tankers were being built too large for the old locks, and every one of them was a customer the canal could not serve. So Panama spent more than $5 billion and nearly a decade building a third lane, a set of enormous new locks, wide enough and deep enough for the giants. In June of 2016, the first of them, a Chinese container ship, made the inaugural crossing. The canal had doubled its capacity and secured its place for another generation. But those larger locks lift larger ships, and larger ships need more water. The engineers knew it and built in a clever answer. Beside each new chamber, they dug water-saving basins, terraced tanks that catch part of the water as a lock drains and hold it, to be poured back in on the next filling. Around 60% of the water is reused instead of lost. It was, on paper, a solution. And then the drought came anyway and made a quiet truth impossible to ignore. You can recycle 60% of the water. You cannot recycle water that never fell as rain. The expansion made the canal bigger, busier, and more essential to the world, and it did nothing to change the one fact underneath everything. The whole machine still drinks the sky, and the sky had begun to hold back. To understand how fragile that is, you have to go back to the water itself, to the river the canal is built on top of, and to what it cost to tame it. The river is called the Chagres, and before it became the servant of the canal, it was its deadliest enemy. In the dry months, the Chagres is calm, a brown, slow ribbon winding through the jungle. But in the wet season, when the rains come down off the hills, it can rise 10 meters in a matter of hours, turning from a river into a wall of water that tears out everything in its path. It was this river, more than the mountains, more even than the disease, that broke the first men who tried to build here. A sea-level canal, a simple trench, could never have survived the Chagres in flood. It would have been scoured out and choked with mud every rainy season for eternity. So the American engineers who inherited the project made a decision that sounds at first like surrender. Instead of fighting the river, they would drown it. They built an enormous dam across the Chagres at a place called Gatun, at the time the largest earthen dam on Earth, and let the river back up behind it. The water rose for years. It filled the valley behind the dam, swallowing farmland, forest, and villages, climbing the hillsides until it had covered more than 400 square kilometers of jungle, an area larger than many cities. When it finally stopped, the drowned valley had become Gatun Lake, the largest man-made lake in the world at the time, and the beating heart of the entire canal. The river that had killed the dream became the reservoir that fed it. But the water did not ask what lay underneath it before it rose. Whole communities were moved off land their families had worked for generations. Forest that had stood for centuries went under and did not come back. To make the shortcut that would join the world, Panama first had to lose a valley, the first of the drownings, though no one thought to call it that yet. And here is the strange thing about a drowning. Sometimes it does not only take, sometimes it leaves behind something that could not have existed otherwise. Because as the lake rose through that valley, the highest ground did not disappear. The hilltops stayed above the water, and one by one, they became islands. The largest of them is called Barro Colorado. When the flood came, the animals of the valley fled upward onto the shrinking high ground until the water stopped and left them stranded. An entire cross-section of the rainforest, marooned on a hilltop in the middle of a shipping lane. Monkeys, sloths, coatis, hundreds of species of birds, thousands of species of insects, all cut off, all suddenly living on an island that had not existed a decade before. Scientists realized almost at once what they had been handed. A piece of tropical forest, sharply bounded by water, small enough to study end to end. A natural laboratory that no one had to design. In 1923, it was set aside for research, and for more than a century since, it has been one of the most intensely studied patches of ground on the entire planet. Hundreds of scientists come every year. A great many of the principles in the modern science of tropical forests were first tested, at some point, on this single, accidental island. Walk its trails, and the forest announces itself before you see it. The howl of the monkeys carries for more than a kilometer, a deep, rolling roar that sounds far larger than the animals making it, mantled howlers calling across the canopy to mark the borders of their world. In the branches move white-faced capuchins, quick and clever. Below them, the three-toed sloth descends so slowly it seems to belong to a different clock entirely, hanging in the green as if time forgot it. Keel-billed toucans clatter overhead, and somewhere above them all, if you are fortunate, moves the harpy eagle, Panama's national bird, one of the most powerful raptors alive, with talons the size of a bear's claws, built to pluck a monkey straight out of the treetops. But the true rulers of this forest are not the eagles or the monkeys. They are the ants. On this one island, researchers have catalogued more than 200 species of ants, and the most remarkable of them are the leafcutters. In columns that can run for 100 meters, they carry fragments of green leaf back to their nests, each ant hoisting a piece many times its own weight, a slow river of moving leaves streaming across the forest floor. But they do not eat the leaves. They carry them underground, chew them into pulp, and use them to grow a fungus, a crop farmed in the dark in vast subterranean gardens tended by millions of workers. These insects were farming the earth tens of millions of years before a single human ever planted a seed. Whole colonies, older and more ordered than any city, working beneath the roots of a forest that only exists because a river was drowned. The valley went under, and out of the drowning came a lake, and out of the lake came an island, and out of the island came a century of knowledge. This is the pattern of this place, though it is still hard to see. Panama has always survived by losing something first. To understand what the canal truly cost, though, you have to go back to the men who tried to build it first, and failed so completely that their failure became one of the great catastrophes of the 19th century. 1. A Frenchman steps onto the isthmus, and he is the most famous engineer alive. His name is Ferdinand de Lesseps. 12 years earlier, he built the Suez Canal, 120 miles of channel cut through the Egyptian desert, joining the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, a triumph that made him a hero across all of France. He is in his mid-70s, and he is certain. Panama, he tells his investors, will be Suez again. A simple sea-level cut, ocean to ocean. He has done it before. He is wrong about almost everything. Suez was flat, dry desert. Panama is mountains and jungle and the Chagres in flood. And there is something else in Panama, something de Lesseps cannot see, because no one on Earth yet understands it. The air itself seems to be killing his men. They arrive by the thousands, French engineers, and behind them, tens of thousands of laborers, most of them Afro-Caribbean workers from Jamaica, from Barbados, from Antigua, come to Panama for wages they cannot earn at home. And they begin to die. Not slowly. A doctor there estimates that in the worst stretches of the wet season, 30 to 40 men are dying every day. Yellow fever turns their skin the color that gives the disease its name, then kills them in a matter of days. Malaria burns through the camps. 3 out of every 4 French engineers who come to join de Lesseps are dead within 3 months of arriving. And no one knows why. The medicine of the age blames the air, foul vapors rising from the swamps, the very meaning of the word malaria, bad air. So they fight the air. They set the legs of the hospital beds in dishes of water, to keep crawling insects from climbing up to the sick. They do not know that those dishes of standing water are breeding the very thing that is killing them. The mosquito. It is the mosquito all along. One kind carrying yellow fever, another carrying malaria, both breeding in every pool of still water the workers leave behind. Every barrel, every puddle, every dish of water beneath every hospital bed is a nursery for the disease. The harder they try to protect the sick by the only logic they have, the more efficiently they kill them. By the time it collapses, the French effort has spent nearly $300 million, and it has buried an estimated 22,000 people. The company goes bankrupt in 1889, a financial disaster so vast it drags down banks and politicians across France, a scandal that reaches even Gustave Eiffel, fresh from his tower, and de Lesseps' own son. The hero of Suez dies a broken man. The jungle begins to take back the machines, rusting them where they stand. "15 years pass, and then a different country decides to try. 1904. The United States takes over the ruins of the French project, and it does two things the French never did. The first is political, and it is not gentle. Panama at the time is a province of Colombia, and Colombia will not agree to the terms the Americans want. So the United States backs a Panamanian revolt, sends a warship, and within days recognizes a brand new country, the Republic of Panama, which promptly signs over a 10-mile-wide strip of its own territory for the canal. A nation is brought into being, in part, so that a canal can be built through it. That decision will echo for the next 100 years. The second thing is medical, and it saves the entire project. An army doctor named William Crawford Gorgas arrives with a conviction most of his colleagues think is madness. In Havana, a few years earlier, Gorgas had watched the theory proven that yellow fever was carried not by filth or bad air, but by a single kind of mosquito. He had acted on that idea in Cuba and cut yellow fever from hundreds of cases to nearly none in a single year. Now he tells the Canal Commission he wants to do the same across 500 square miles of jungle. Drain every pool, pour oil on every puddle to suffocate the larvae, screen every window, fumigate every building. One commissioner called his ideas balmy, but the president backs him, and Gorgas goes to war on an insect. It works. By the end of 1905, yellow fever is vanishing from the isthmus. Within a couple of years, it is gone entirely. A last case, and then no more. Malaria is harder and never fully beaten, but it is driven down and down. The thing that had killed the French was not the mountain, and not the river, and not the distance. It was an insect the size of a fingernail, and once a man finally understood that, the impossible canal became possible. It was still not cheap in lives. Even with the fevers broken, the digging itself killed. The worst of it was the Culebra Cut, the place where the canal had to be carved straight through the spine of the Continental Divide, through hundreds of feet of rock and unstable clay. The slopes would not hold. Again and again, entire hillsides slid back down into the channel the men had just cleared, burying the work, and sometimes the workers. 68 steam shovels labored in the cut at once. Trains hauled the blasted rock away by the millions of tons. And through it all, men died. In landslides, in dynamite blasts, under the wheels of the trains, another 5,600 lives on the American side, most of them, once again, Afro-Caribbean laborers whose names were never written down. On August 15, 1914, a ship called the Uncut made the first official passage from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The dream of 4 centuries was real. The world had been rejoined, and almost no one noticed. 2 weeks earlier, the First World War had begun, and the eyes of the world were fixed on Europe. The greatest engineering feat of the age opened quietly in the shadow of a far greater catastrophe. For most of the century that followed, though, the canal was not really Panama's. Look at Panama City today, and you see a skyline that could belong to Singapore or Dubai. A wall of glass towers along the Pacific shore, banks and apartments catching the sun, one of the fastest-growing financial capitals in Latin America. Ships gather in the anchorage beneath the great arc of the Bridge of the Americas, waiting their turn to climb the locks.
It is a city built,
in large part, on the wealth that flows through the waterway a few miles to the north. But for generations, a Panamanian standing in that city looked north at the canal and saw something that did not belong to them. The strip of land on either side of the water, the Canal Zone, was, by the Treaty of 1903, controlled by the United States, as if it were the sovereign in perpetuity. It had its own government, its own police, its own courts, its own schools. Tens of thousands of Americans lived there. They called themselves Zonians, many of them born on the isthmus, some for generations, inside a manicured enclave that cut the country of Panama cleanly in half. To cross from one side of your own nation to the other, you pass through a piece of someone else's. The resentment built for decades, and in January of 1964, it broke. The trigger was almost unbearably small. A flag. Panamanian students walked into the zone carrying their national flag to raise it, as an agreement had promised they could, beside the American one at a zone high school. In the scuffle that followed, the flag was torn, and the country ignited. 3 days of rioting swept the isthmus. When it ended, more than 20 Panamanians were dead, along with 4 American soldiers. Panama severed diplomatic relations with the United States, the only time a Latin American nation has ever done so. In Panama, the day is remembered still. They call it the Day of the Martyrs. The killing changed something. Slowly, over more than a decade, one American president after another came to the same conclusion, that holding the canal by force, against the will of the country it ran through, was no longer worth the cost. And in 1977, a Panamanian general named Omar Torrijos and an American president named Jimmy Carter signed 2 treaties with a single promise at their center. At noon on the last day of the century, the 31st of December 1999, the canal would become Panama's. Torrijos had a way of describing what the zone had been. A foreign flag, he said, piercing the heart of his country. The road to that handover was not smooth. Torrijos died in a plane crash in 1981, and power in Panama passed to a military strongman named Manuel Noriega, a man who grew steadily more brutal and more entangled in drug trafficking, until in 1989, the United States invaded Panama to remove him by force. It was a violent, disputed chapter, and it left its own dead. But the treaties held. When the fighting was over, Panama returned to civilian government, and it did something quiet and shrewd. It wrote the independence of the canal directly into its constitution, creating an authority to run the waterway that would stand apart from the churn of ordinary politics, staffed by its own engineers and pilots. And at noon, on the final day of 1999, the American flag came down. The Panamanian flag rose over the canal, and for the first time since the first shovel of French dirt in 1881, the waterway through Panama belonged to Panama. Much of Latin America watched it as the end of the last colony on the continent. Panama has run it, by most measures, better than it was run before. Transit times down, accident rates down, the whole system modernized and then dramatically enlarged. And yet the question of who should truly control this water has never entirely gone quiet. Even now, more than a century after the Ancon first crossed, voices in the north still ask aloud whether the canal should have been handed over at all. It is a reminder that a shortcut between two oceans is never only an engineering project. It is always also a question of power, and Panama has learned to answer that question carefully and on its own terms. Nowhere is the strangeness of the canal's wealth sharper than at its Atlantic mouth, in the city of Colón. Colón sits at the Caribbean end of the waterway, and beside it lies one of the largest free trade zones on the planet, a walled commercial city where billions of dollars of goods move in and out, duty-free, every year, bound for markets across the Americas. Through Colón passes an ocean of merchandise, electronics, textiles, machinery, the endless traffic of global commerce. And Colón itself is one of the poorest cities in Panama. Step outside the gates of the free zone and you find crumbling buildings, unemployment, whole neighborhoods that have seen little of the fortune passing through them. A city that handles a share of the world's riches and keeps almost none of it. The contradiction is not subtle, and the people who live there feel it every day. The particular ache of standing in the doorway through which everything flows, holding an empty hand. It is the canal's oldest tension, written small. Enormous value moves through this country. The question of who it actually reaches has never been fully answered. And there is another Panama, one that has almost nothing to do with the canal and everything to do with the water. Off the Caribbean coast, east of the waterway, lies a scatter of more than 300 coral islands called Guna, the Sandblast Islands, home to the Guna people. Their story is, in its own way, the mirror image of the canals. Centuries ago, the Guna left the mainland to escape colonial rule and the mosquito-borne fevers of the jungle, and made their homes out on the low coral atolls, where the sea breeze kept the sickness away. And in 1925, in the very years the canal was cementing American power over the isthmus, the Guna did something no other indigenous people in Latin America had managed. They rose up. Led by a chief named Nele Cantule, they drove out the Panamanian authorities who had tried to erase their language and forbid their traditional dress. And they won, becoming the first indigenous nation on the continent to secure real political autonomy inside a modern state. A treaty made in the aftermath of that revolution still stands. The Guna govern Guna on their own terms, and every February they reenact the uprising in the streets so that the children will never forget how the land was kept. But the sea that once protected them is now rising to take them. The Guna Islands sit barely half a meter to a meter above the water, and the ocean around them is climbing. By recent measurements, more than twice as fast as it did in the 1960s. On the crowded island of Gadi Sugdub, floods that once came rarely began coming every year, seawater running down the lanes between the houses. And in June of 2024, the people of Gadi Sugdub did what their ancestors had done in reverse. They left the island and moved back to the mainland. Around 1,000 of them, resettled in a new town of concrete houses called Isberiala. They became the first community in Panama that the government formally recognized as displaced by a changing climate. Scientists at the same Smithsonian Institute that studies Barrow, Colorado, now warn that every one of the inhabited Guna Islands may have to be abandoned before the century is out. A people who once fled the mainland for the sea and won their freedom on the water, now fleeing the sea back to the mainland to survive it. In Panama, the water gives and the water takes, and it does not much care which century it is. There is one more thing the outside world rarely pictures about this waterway, a quiet detail that says more about modern Panama than any treaty. Every single ship that crosses the canal, no matter how vast, no matter whose flag it flies, gives up its command to do it. At the entrance, a Panama Canal pilot boards the vessel and takes navigational control. And for the hours it takes to cross, the captain of that ship, master of everything he surveys on the open sea, must stand aside. In the narrow chambers of the locks, small electric locomotives called mules run along the walls, holding the hull centered by cable with only inches to spare on either side. Line handlers walk the lock walls. It is a choreography of enormous mass and tiny margins, performed thousands of times a year, almost always without a scratch. The largest and most powerful ships on Earth arriving from every nation, and each of them, for a few hours in Panama, in local hands. Whatever the arguments about who owns the canal, this much has been settled since 1999. The pilot on the bridge is Panamanian. Which brings us back to the water, and to the $4 million. In 2023, the rains did not come. An El Niño, a shift in the Pacific that warms the ocean and dries out Central America, settled over Panama, and the wet country stopped being wet. That October was the driest in more than 70 years of record-keeping, and the level of Gatun Lake, the number that global shipping had been able to ignore for 100 years, began to fall. The canal did the only thing it could. It began turning ships away. Where 36 or more vessels had crossed on an ordinary day, the authority cut the number to 30, then 25, and toward 18, half the normal traffic. It lowered the maximum depth that ships could sit in the water, which meant the largest vessels had to carry less cargo or leave some behind to ride high enough to cross. Some unloaded part of their cargo onto trains to be carried across the isthmus and reloaded on the far side, the way the gold rush travelers had done a century and a half before. The line at the mouth of the canal grew past 100 ships. The wait stretched into days and then longer, and the world's shipping had to choose. Wait in the line for who knew how long. Sail all the way around the bottom of South America, around Cape Horn, or through the Strait of Magellan, adding thousands of miles and weeks of fuel, exactly as ships had done before 1914. Take the long way around Africa. A cruise line simply cancelled its Panama season altogether. Or, if the cargo was valuable enough, if the deadline was tight enough, pay. So the auctions ran hot. In ordinary times, a last-minute slot might change hands for $135,000. As the drought bit, the bidding climbed, past $1 million, and then, in November of 2023, to the number that ran in headlines around the world. $4 million for one ship, to cross one country, on top of every ordinary fee. And even the winner still waited nearly a week. It was the clearest price anyone had ever put on rain. Strip away everything else, and what a ship was really bidding on in that auction was water. The 200 million liters of fresh water it would take to lift that hull over the mountains. In a wet year, that water is free and endless and beneath anyone's notice. In a dry year, it becomes the most valuable thing in the shipping world. And when, 2.5 years later, a distant war throttled the Strait of Hormuz and pushed the world's energy trade back through Panama, the $4 million bid returned, proof that the first time had not been a fluke, but a glimpse of the future. And Panama cannot simply turn the ships away for good. The canal is not only the world's shortcut, it is the spine of Panama's own economy. In recent years, the waterway has delivered well over $2 billion a year straight into the national treasury, one of the largest single sources of money the country has. Schools, roads, hospitals. A great deal of what Panama can afford, it can afford because the ships keep crossing. To starve the canal of water is to starve the nation that lives on it. And so, the pressure runs only one way. Find more water, wherever it can be found, whatever it costs, and whoever happens to be living on top of it. And here is where the whole story turns and shows you what it has been about all along. The Panama Canal is not, in the end, a trench where two oceans meet. It is a machine that survives by drinking rain, and when the rain fails, it survives by drowning things. It drowned a river to be born. It drowned a valley to make its lake. And now, to keep breathing through a future of thinner and less certain rains, it has decided to drown again. West of the canal runs another river, the Rio Indio, and the plan, approved by the canal's authority, is to build a great dam across it, flood its basin, and carry that water through a tunnel 9 kilometers long into Gatun Lake. A new reservoir, more than 4,000 hectares of it, at a cost of $1.5 billion, to guarantee the canal's water for the next 50 years, and, the authority promises, to supply drinking water for more than half of Panama's people at the same time. But the basin of the Rio Indio is not empty. People live there. Digna Benite has lived on the banks of the Rio Indio for 60 years. She remembers playing in its water as a child while her father fished. This river, she says, is my whole life. Her village, and dozens like it, sit inside the ground the new reservoir would put underwater, as many as 2,000, perhaps 2,500 people to be moved, and by some counts, across the wider basin, many thousands more affected. Farmers who have worked the same red soil for 40 years, communities reached only by boat, along the very river that would become their flood. They have refused to sell. They have taken to the water in fleets of dugout canoes, waving Panamanian flags, chanting that the river is not for sale, that the river is to be defended. One farmer, Claudino Dominguez, keeps horses on the single paved road of his village. He is 63 years old. He arrived 4 decades ago and raised his children on that land. He is asked whether he feels any pride in the canal, the great machine a few miles away that would flood his home. Why, he asks, would I feel pride about something that doesn't benefit me? It is the oldest arithmetic of this place laid bare one more time. To join the world, Panama drowned a valley and asked the people of that valley to bear it. To keep the world joined, it may drown another, and the people being asked to bear it now are, many of them, people who never saw a cent of the wealth that flows through their country's greatest asset. The government calls it progress and points to the drinking water it would bring to half a nation. The farmers call it the loss of everything they have. Both are telling the truth.
Whose water is it?
The ships that needed to cross and carry the trade of nations, or the peoples who live on the river and drink from it and bury their dead beside it? The canal's answer for 100 years has been the same. The water belongs to the crossing. Stand at the locks today and watch a ship rise. The gates close, the water pours in from the lake above, and 100,000 tons of steel floats gently upward, lifted by nothing but rain and gravity, until it is riding 85 feet above the ocean it came from. It is still one of the most quietly astonishing sights on Earth. A mountain of cargo carried over the spine of a continent on a staircase of fresh water. 14,000 times a year, without ceremony, without applause. For more than a century, this narrow strip of Panama has answered a question the rest of the world found impossible: how to join two oceans. And it has answered it with a kind of genius. But it has never once answered it for free. It cost 22,000 lives to try and fail, 5,600 more to try and succeed. It cost a valley and a river and the homes of the people who lived on both. It cost Panama half a century of watching a foreign flag fly over the heart of its own country, and it took a day of martyrs to begin winning it back. Every single time this place has joined itself to the world, it has paid in something it could not get back. And the bill is not finished. The rains that filled the lake for 100 years are less dependable than they were. The ships are larger and more numerous, and each one still drinks its 200 million liters. Somewhere out over the Pacific, another dry year is always forming. And in the basin of the Rio Indio, a woman stands on a riverbank that may not exist in a decade and says that this water is her whole life. While a few miles away, a ship's owner decides whether the crossing is worth $4 million. It is happening at both ends of the country at once. Inland, along the Rio Indio, Panama prepares to flood a valley because there is not enough fresh water for the canal. Out on the Caribbean reefs, the Guna abandon their islands because there is too much of the wrong water, rising where it never used to reach. A nation losing land to the water it does not have, and to the water it cannot hold back, the same element, taking from both directions. There is no clean ending to offer here, and it would be a lie to invent one. The canal will go on. The ships will keep rising over the mountains, and the world will keep leaning on this one thin waterway. And Panama will keep making the hardest choice a country can make, deciding again and again what it is willing to drown in order to stay connected to everyone else. Perhaps that is the truest thing about this place, not that it joined the oceans, but that it never stopped paying for it, and it never will. A shortcut is only ever short for the ships passing through. For the country holding it up, it is the longest road there is. Thank you for traveling with us across the Isthmus of Panama. Take a breath, stay a while, and until the next journey, we'll see you soon.